Hey everyone, um, welcome to the first video on the Fearless Wisdom YouTube channel. Uh, First things first, before I get started on this topic, um, just give a quick disclaimer because I think it's important to know where someone's coming from when they do these YouTube videos about important academic topics. I'm not an academic uh, or have like formal education in this subject. I have a BA in history, but I didn't study this specific subject. So I'm mostly self-taught when it comes to philosophy and when it comes to religious studies and the history of Buddhist thought in general. Um, but I've spent some years studying this, so I feel like maybe I can contribute something important. I will cite my academic sources at the end of the video. And I think another thing that's important to say in the beginning is that yes, I do consider myself a Buddhist, even if I'm not a very traditional one. And I think it's important for people to know where someone's coming from or where someone stands when they're giving a lecture on these topics. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. So, this video is mainly meant to be a world map of Buddhist philosophy, a historical world map. It's going to give a broad overview of over 2,000 years of Buddhist thought. Part one, which is this video, is going to go over Indian Buddhist philosophy. And part two is going to go over the history of Buddhist philosophy in the rest of the world after it mostly died out in India. So in Asia, Tibet, Southeast Asia, and all the way up to modern Buddhism. So it has a very broad scope. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of generalizations and omissions, but it is going to help people get a lay of the land and have a look at the entire field. And then later, hopefully I can, when I have the time, make other videos that will be able to zoom in on specific topics, or obviously people can, use this video as a kind of launching pad for their own individual studies. Obviously, this video is a map, and a map is not the territory, but hopefully it will have a similar structure to the main history of Buddhist philosophy and will be useful for some people. So why study this specific topic? And part of the reason why I'm like starting to do this videos is this is a bit of an apologia on this whole issue. It's that Western academic philosophy is narrow. It should basically be called Western philosophy instead of just philosophy. And there's a philosopher called Jay Garfield who studies Buddhist philosophy, and he sort of has made this point rather forcefully in some articles. Just a lot of people in the Western Academy are kind of ignorant of philosophical discussions in other philosophical cultures, and this is almost a kind of provincialism where you're just focused on your own little world. And in a globalized world, this is just not cool. I mean, throughout human history, other human beings outside of the Euro-American world have thought deeply about the same philosophical questions, about the nature of reality, for thousands of years, and just completely ignoring this and just harms the depth and breadth of our philosophical inquiry. It deprives us of valuable philosophical insights and conversation partners. One common metaphor, one common way of thinking about philosophy is that it's a conversation. And if you think about it this way, then imagine just spending your entire life having a conversation with a small group of people and not going out of that bubble. Um, and another way of thinking about philosophy is as a kind of sport. And if you think about philosophy as a sport with different teams, different philosophical schools, and then there's different matches where there's debates between different ideas. We're Western academic philosophy is playing regional matches, not playing in the World Cup. So another issue here is that these non-Western philosophers, they're human beings just like we are. It's not like they're inferior somehow, like, they're epistemic peers. And we just can't ignore what they've been saying for thousands of years and just, like, now that information is available, it's available in English, it's been translated, there's Indian philosophy in translation, there's Chinese philosophy in translation. It's like just completely ignoring what they said is just problematic. And I mean, don't we want to have our conversations be more broad and to expand the scope of our discussions in philosophy? I mean, I think that's a worthwhile goal. And I guess with something more that I've noticed on YouTube per se is discussions on philosophy of religion on YouTube. It's very narrow. Like, 90% or more is just Western monotheists debating atheists, naturalists, and using the same kinds of arguments that one sees in Western philosophy for since like Aquinas and Plato. And don't get me wrong, like these topics are fascinating, like cosmological argument, ontological arguments, and like you go back and forth forever on this stuff. And I know I've watched like so much hours of content, days of content. Shout out to Majesty of Reason, like I love that channel. But the sad thing is you just never see discussions of Chinese or Indic philosophy of religion, or even African. I mean, did you guys know that like the religions that are related to the Yoruba religion are one of the largest religions in the world? That's, and they have their own worldview of what ultimate reality is and what God is. And it's just like same thing with Indian philosophy, all these different branches, and Chinese thought. So I mean, it's just it's time to be less provincial and narrow in philosophy. And part of the reason why I'm doing this channel is just to kind of remedy that situation a little bit, and to bring the little knowledge that I have, which is mainly in Indian philosophy and mostly in Western in Buddhist philosophy, I mean, with a little bit of my knowledge of Western philosophy as well, and maybe do like a little cross-cultural conversation, and maybe open up and expand the scope of discussion a little bit. And hopefully this encourages people who are knowledgeable in like Chinese philosophy and African philosophy, which I know so little about, but I'd love to see more content of out there. So I mean, hopefully I can help expand people's horizons on philosophy of religion on YouTube. So what is Buddhist philosophy? It's philosophy in a Buddhist context, right? In the simplest definition that I can think of. Buddhism is a religion, and it has a long philosophical tradition as well of serious inquiry into the broadest and most fundamental questions about reality. We're just thinking of philosophy as asking the most fundamental questions, right? How things hang together in the most broadest possible way. Then Buddhists also ask those questions, just like Christians did and Muslims did. Obviously, Buddhist philosophy, like every other kind of philosophy, is also very diverse. And just like Western philosophers disagree on almost everything, Buddhist philosophers disagreed with each other. But there's also a broad agreement on certain topics, and also the questions that frame the dialectic. Buddhist philosophy concerned with the human condition. It's very concerned with the human condition. That's kind of where it begins, especially the nature of human suffering, dukkha, which is a Pali and Sanskrit word that has a broad semantic field. It doesn't just mean pain and suffering, but it also can mean unease, dissatisfaction, anxiety, stress, just not being okay. And Buddhist philosophy kind of begins with that human, all too human point of view of we're here and it's not okay. Like something's wrong, right? Something's broken, and how does this arise? How does this state of dissatisfaction arise? It arises from a kind of ignorance, a kind of primal confusion, because we don't understand how things are. So how do we get rid of it? So that's kind of like a central concern in Buddhist philosophy that all Buddhist thinkers would agree. Another thing that makes Buddhist philosophy interesting to me is that it's strongly tied to religious praxis, and so it's primarily a philosophy as a way of life. Shout out to Pierre Hadot, who wrote a book that focuses on how like ancient philosophy was also kind of not just an intellectual exercise, but it was a way to organize your life, right? So like Stoicism and these ancient philosophies that had you develop your virtue in different ways. Buddhist philosophy, therefore, has strong pragmatic concerns from the very beginning. And the primary question being, how are we to live so as to be free? And being free here means free of suffering, egoistic grasping, free of non-virtue, and free to love, right? Because there's clearly certain ways in which we are not free, in a deep sense. And Buddhist philosophy tries to answer questions about those issues. So the Buddhist concern for ending suffering is not something that is sought for its own sake, and it's not something that's seen as separate from the pursuit of truth. In this case, truth is not being sought for its own sake or only for its own sake, but for how it can contribute to the soteriological project of attaining freedom. In this sense, meaning the ending of suffering, nirvana, the ultimate goal. But it can also refer to worldly, day-to-day sufferings and bringing those to an end. In this sense, philosophy, love of wisdom, is not something that is done just because we want to find the truth, but it is an aid in our quest for attaining the highest kind of freedom and liberation. In the Buddhist understanding, we are suffering because we do not understand the true nature of things or how things exist. In fact, we're deeply confused, and we experience the world in a deluded way that leads to our suffering. So philosophy is very important in doing away with that confusion. Once we understand how things really are, not just conceptually, but through certain meditative practices that are also taught in Buddhism, then we can align our way of living and being to the way things are. And this is the Buddhist understanding of how philosophy aids in the project of liberation. Now, this project is not easy, and it requires a lot of work, philosophical and non-philosophical. But it begins with philosophy. And what I mean by that is, like in the Eightfold Path, which begins with right understanding, you can't start to practice the path if you don't know what you're practicing, and you don't know how you're practicing, and you don't know the nature of reality, or at least you don't have a basic schema for understanding how reality works. And in this sense, philosophy is absolutely central to the practice of Buddhism. So to give a general background to Indian Buddhism, we have to begin with the Vedic religion. This is an ancient Indo-European religion which, by the time of the Buddha, was based on priests and the sacrifices and rituals that they performed on behalf of them and their clients to the gods. These rituals were believed to purify evil, bad karma, to bring good fortune, and to help us attain heaven after death. They were also believed to help us attain certain mundane goods, such as having children, gaining wealth, and so on. Now, out of this tradition arose a group of sages and ascetics, which began to see Vedic rites as not being so important. And instead, they began to focus on a kind of philosophical and religious inquiry into ultimate truth, which they called Brahman. And they were also asking certain questions about how this ultimate truth was related to the conscious self, Atman, which was seen as a general eternal reality that existed in all people. And it underwent reincarnation. It was also subject to karma, but it was also this unchanging and eternal reality. These sages mainly lived in forests or in the wilderness, and they practiced asceticism, meditations, mantra, repetition, and they were seeking liberation from the cycle of reincarnation, something which they called moksha, and it was understood in different ways. One of the ways in which it was understood was that oneself would merge with the larger Brahman, with the ultimate truth, either at death or something which they believed was also something which could be achieved in this life, at least temporarily. They still looked to the Vedas as a guide, but they interpreted the Vedas in different ways, in a less ritualistic way and more symbolically. And the rituals were internalized more as meditations or ways of contemplating ultimate truth, instead of seeing it as just a kind of ritual exchange in which you gave something to the gods, either an animal or milk or some kind of food, and then the gods would give some kind of reward back. The teachings of these sages can be found in the early Upanishads, the most ancient of which are the Brihadaranyaka and the Chandogya Upanishads. Now, before the time of the Buddha and during the time of the Buddha, there was another group of ascetic sages. And these were mostly non-Vedic sages. And they had a much more varied set of views and philosophical ideas. Most of these Shramanas, as they were called, were unconcerned with the Vedas, with Vedic rites, or with Vedic deities. But they did affirm reincarnation and karma, at least most of them did. And they sought a way out of this cyclical round of life and death, which was seen as filled with suffering and something that one should seek to escape. They sought liberation through strict ascetic practices, living in the forest, living a simple mendicant life, non-violent and non-harming of all living things, including all animals. There were many groups of these sages. Perhaps the largest and most influential group, which is still around today, are the Jains. They are quite ancient, and it's hard to know exactly when this group started. But what we do know is that they focused on living a non-violent life, not hurting any sentient beings whatsoever, and they practiced strict asceticism, including long periods of fasting in which they would either eat nothing or very little. They would also practice certain meditative practices where they would sit still for long periods of time, or stand still and just completely immobile, just be completely immobile. There is an image of Mahavira, which was the main leader of the Jains during the Buddha's time. And you can also see that he is naked. So at least at some point, certain Jains were practicing a ascetic practice in which you do not wear any clothes whatsoever, and you are living outside in a forest or in the wilderness without any clothes, so you're exposed to the elements. So they were quite a strict ascetic group. There are also other groups. One of them was called the Ajnanas, which literally means agnostic. That nya is the same Indo-European phoneme that we have in agnostic. And they were kind of skeptics, similar in a way to the Greek skeptics. They refused to take specific philosophical positions on numerous topics. And it seems like they sought liberation through a kind of ataraxia, in the way that the skeptics sought to let go of all philosophical views and disputes and just have a free mind, completely unconcerned with these ideas. There were also another group called the Ajivikas. Very little is known about them, but the sources we do have seem to point to a belief in some kind of determinism or fate. But it seems like they also believed that living a ascetic life, a simple life, was important. So they had a whole philosophical and religious system in which they were able to bring together some kind of idea of determinism with the practice of ethics and meditation and other kinds of spiritual practices. Lastly, there seem to have been a group of materialist ascetics. In a way, they're kind of like the Epicureans, because even though they rejected the afterlife and they believed that only matter exists, they also had certain practices that could be seen as either spiritual or a kind of Epicurean psychology in which you are trying to live a peaceful life, a happy life. And it seems like some of these Charvaka ascetics were also living quite strict lives in a manner similar to the other Shramanas. So it's not like their materialism led them to reject all spiritual practices completely, or all modes of life that were affirmed by the Shramanas. These different groups were constantly engaging each other in public debates. And actually, these debates, they followed certain rules of debate that we can tease out of the ancient texts that we find. You would try to get your opponent to contradict himself. You would point out if there was circular reasoning. So already in the ancient Indian religious world, we have certain forms of reasoning being worked out, and these forms of reasoning are being used in debate. So there was already a kind of philosophy tradition developing before the Buddha came to formulate his own tradition and his own system. And he drew on these various traditions and the tradition of philosophical debate and discussion that existed before his time. So now we get to the founder of Buddhism, the Buddha, which just means the awakened one. His family name was Gautama, and he's called Sakyamuni, which means the sage of the Sakyas, which is the tribe that he was born into. He was born in a Sakyan town called Kapilavastu on the modern border of India and Nepal. These Sakyans were a non-Vedic tribe living in the foothills of the Himalayas. This is confirmed by certain Vedic texts, actually, which name the Sakyans and the area where they lived as being outside of the Aryavarta, the land of the Vedic people, of the Aryans. The religion of the Sakyas was likely some form of animism. This is something that is argued by Levman in the source I have here on this slide. So he was not a Hindu. And actually, this is something that if you want to trigger a Buddhist, tell him that the Buddha was a Hindu, because there's a huge kind of political thing going on where certain Hindus are trying to say that the Buddha was a Hindu and are claiming the Buddha as a Hindu, as someone who taught Hinduism, but that's wrong for many reasons. One is that the Hindu is mainly a tradition which comes from the Vedas, and the Buddha himself wasn't born into this tradition, even though he did practice with certain sages that might have been Hindu. But also modern Hinduism as it exists today is something which developed over hundreds of years. So I mean, don't want to get too much into that, but yeah, just he wasn't what would be called a Hindu today. He was also not a prince, right? There's these later legends that developed that he was a prince born into a dynasty, and his father was a king of this huge realm. But he was born into this tribal society to someone who was probably a tribal elite. But what we're talking about here is a small-scale tribal society with small wooden towns being run by a small council of elites. But we're not talking about a huge kingdom where one person has absolute control over the kingdom. So the idea that the Buddha was born to a king of this vast realm and he left it all, this is not really something that's supported by the historical sources that we have, the earliest sources. What we do know is he left home contra the protestations of his parents, who were unhappy that he did this, and he wandered throughout the countryside, studying with different sages, with the Upanishadic Vedic sages as well as with Shamanas. He seems to have practiced with both groups and practiced their different methods of meditation, strict fasting, and so forth. But he became dissatisfied with both of these traditions for various reasons, but it mainly seems like he just did not think that they were leading to the ultimate truth and liberation. And he went off on his own to contemplate the truth, meditate by himself. And he seems to have, he claims that he attained a state of awakening where he was free from suffering and he had gained some kind of transcendent spiritual knowledge or had some kind of spiritual experience. And then after that, he taught a new philosophical and religious way of life and way of understanding the world for over 40 years and built a large religious community in North India that became what modern Buddhism is today. Now, the teachings of the Buddha, the earliest sources for the teachings of the Buddha are found in what are called the early Buddhist texts. There's various collections of ancient material found in parts of the Pali Canon, parts of the Chinese canon called the Agamas. Also, there's some in the Tibetan canon. And these are the agreed upon by most historians as the earliest sources for the teachings of early Buddhism. Perhaps one of the most important of these teachings is the famous Four Noble Truths, the Arya Satya, which some other scholars have said that it is better to translate this as the four truths for the noble ones. That is to say, it's not that the truths themselves are noble, but that these are the truths that are understood by the noble persons, that is, those people that have reached liberation. The first of these is that there is dukkha, which is a word which is translated as suffering, as distress or stress, and as unease. And it's not just pain and very strong feelings of suffering, but can also refer to very subtle forms of suffering. In fact, according to this early Buddhist view, almost all experiences, all experiences that we have are actually dukkha. So even the most pleasurable experience of eating something extremely delicious or experiencing, sexual pleasure, that's actually dukkha too. So this is a word that has a semantic field much broader than just suffering, but suffering is not a bad translation. The second of these is that there are conditions for dukkha. The dukkha depends on certain conditions. There is a chain of causes and conditions which begins with ignorance or delusion about the nature of the world and develops into craving, grasping, or aversion, or different other mental defilements that lead to dukkha, for experiencing the world in a less than ideal manner. And then the third truth is the reversal of the second. If you bring an end to those conditions which cause suffering, then suffering can be brought to an end. And there's a kind of implied premise here, perhaps the kind of a zeroth noble truth, or the fifth noble truth, that dukkha is worth eliminating, right? It's sort of assumed that we want to eliminate suffering here. The fourth noble truth, then, is there is a path that we can follow to bring an end to suffering. Actually, in the early Buddhist texts, there are many different formulations of the path. There's the Eightfold Path, but there's also various expositions which are called the Graduated Path, which have different forms and different lists of things that are to be done and practiced that are different than the Eightfold Path. And so there isn't really a single path, or perhaps there isn't a single way to explain the path. There are many ways to explain the path. One way to look at this model of the Four Noble Truths is through a kind of ancient Indian medical model, in which you point out the sickness, you point out the cause of the sickness, then you explain how to eliminate the cause and the sickness, and then you lay out a treatment plan to follow. And the Buddha was indeed often compared to a doctor, and his teaching was seen as a kind of medicine. So this is a common metaphor that's used in the Buddhist texts. Now, perhaps one of the most unique and interesting things about the Buddha as a thinker is that perhaps we could say he was the first thinker in the world to take the difficulty and complexity of personal identity seriously. For the Buddha, persons, the self, is simply a causal stream of constantly changing psychophysical processes. There is no unchanging core or essence. And this is the famous anatman or anatta theory, which is found in Buddhism. Before the Buddha taught, Indian thinkers generally posited some kind of eternal self, some kind of eternal existence, an unchanging essence, which was at the core of a person, of all persons. But the Buddha pointed out that altered states of consciousness and just phenomenological reflection shows that the self, whatever a person is and whatever a person's mind stream consciousness is, it is something which is dependent on many other factors, and it's something which is transient and constantly changing. And it is also made up of parts, which we can observe. So the Buddha offered a kind of analysis of self and of all of reality, which is based on change, on process, on dependency. And this is the Buddhist teaching of dependent arising or dependent origination, which is very closely connected with the teaching of Anatman, because the teaching that everything arises dependently and every phenomena arises dependent on something else shows how the self cannot be an independently existing thing or some kind of independent essence. So according to this teaching, all phenomena, all things arise dependently. And it is because we don't understand this and that we assume that we exist independently that we reify reality. And when this reification comes into contact with the true nature of things, which is how they change and how they're dependent, this causes suffering and all sorts of problems which lead to suffering. These theories, the Anatman and the dependent arising theory, the Pratitya Samutpada, are the basis of all Buddhist soteriology, religious practice, and all of Buddhism. So what are the main philosophical reasons that the Buddha has for rejecting a self? Well, this is outlined in several texts, but the most important of these is the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, and there's various parallels in other sources to this important text. The first thing we need to understand is the Buddha provides an analysis of the person which breaks it up into 5 parts, and these are called the 5 skandhas, which is translated as aggregate, but it just means like a pile or a heap of stuff. So if you just have a person, you can divide it up into 5 things, 5 processes. And an implied premise of the Buddhist argument against the self is that all parts of the person can be subsumed into these 5 categories. And these 5 categories are physical form, rupa, feelings, vedana, which is really the feeling tone, whether something is experienced as being pleasant or whether something is experienced as being unpleasant. Then there's perception. There is willing, which can also include a broader range of mental phenomena, thoughts and different feelings about things, feelings that aren't simply just pleasurable and unpleasurable, but more complex feelings, and so on. And then the 5th skandha is consciousness, which is mainly just the awareness of things, the conscious, phenomenal consciousness of all experiences. Now, these 5 psychophysical processes, which make up all persons, are all seen as being impermanent and constantly changing. And according to the Buddha, all views, all ideas or conceptions of a substantial self are based on either one of these or some of them put together. It could be all of them. And this is very clearly outlined in the source I have here, the text I have here, which is the Samyutta Nikaya 2247, which says, whenever any ascetics or Brahmins conceive various things as a self, all of them are relying on the 5 grasping aggregates, or one of them. Now, this is important because in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta and other parallel sources, the Buddha rejects that any of these 5 aggregates can be a self. So, by doing this, he is rejecting that a self can exist at all. And the way he does this is by outlining how when we inspect our experience, we can see that the 5 aggregates are always changing. They're never static. All of these are dynamic processes. They are also experienced very often as being painful or distressing. And even though we would like to change that experience, we often cannot. Thus, there cannot be something which is unchanging, fixed or static, and there cannot be something which is a totally blissful self. And this is going against the Upanishadic idea of a self, which holds that there's something which is eternal and also blissful in all persons, and that there's this unchanging consciousness which is eternal in all people. And the Buddha is rejecting that. He's saying, no, consciousness, even consciousness, is something which is constantly changing, it's dependent, and we experience it as distressing in many ways. Another line of attack he takes against the self is that all of these 5 aggregates are ultimately beyond our control. We might be able to change some of these aggregates in certain ways, in certain limited ways, but we do not have complete control over them. And part of the Upanishadic idea of a self was that it was a controller, an inner controller, which controlled all things, controlled the body, controlled all experiences. But according to the Buddha, there is no inner controller or CEO. There's just a causal chain of many different experiences, many different things that are going on in a person. And in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, he clearly states that form is not self. If it was, it couldn't cause trouble or pain, and you could make it do whatever you wanted. You could decide, I wish my physical form was like this, and it would happen. But since you can't just change your body at will, and form causes you pain, even though you don't want it, it is not a self. And then he goes over all 5 aggregates in a similar fashion, showing that we do not have complete control over it, and it is something which is constantly changing. Each of those 5 aggregates is something which is constantly changing, and we have little control over how they change. So this is kind of the basic argument that the Buddha launches against an essential self. Notice here how this doesn't necessarily mean we can't use the word self to refer to a person in a kind of conventional everyday sense. And indeed, the Buddha in the sutras, often uses the word Atman to refer to himself, because that is just the word that word just means self in ancient Indian languages. So what he's rejecting is a substantial, independent, existing self, which is unchanging and has complete control over all phenomena. He is not rejecting that, there's a kind of psychological feeling of a self. That exists, and in many cases it is problematic, but it is not a kind of inner essence which was held to be the self by the Upanishadic philosophers and many other thinkers throughout history, right? There's many theories of a soul, of an unchanging essence, and so on and so forth, in many religions and philosophies. So it is this that the Buddha is rejecting here, not just not a basic psychological conception of a personality. Now, the Buddha did not just reject a individual essential self or a individual eternal self. He also rejected the Brahminical idea of a cosmic self, the monistic idea that there is a eternal, unchanging, universal self, that it just is the whole universe. And this can be found in the Alagaddupama Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 22, where the Buddha clearly rejects that view as one of the 6 wrong views about a self, the other 5 being the 5 aggregates. And he explains his view that he rejects as, at death I shall become permanent, eternal, unchanging, and remain forever the same, and that is mine, that is me, that is myself. A wise and well-trained person sees that all these positions are wrong, and so are not anxious about what does not exist. So sometimes people say the Buddha did not reject this monistic view, he just rejected individual self. but that the monistic view that's sometimes held in certain schools of modern Hinduism today, like Advaita Vedanta, it is said that he did not reject that view, but we see that he rejected all of the ancient views of the self, including the monistic view of the self. And mainly because he saw that it had similar problems to views of the self that are just talking about an individual self. It has the same kinds of problems, just expanded to include the whole universe. Now, it's important to understand that this not self theory is not a kind of nihilism or not a kind of annihilationism, which holds that there is something substantial but that gets destroyed since it is impermanent and so on. The Buddha clearly rejected both essentialist views that there's an essential self and nihilistic views that believe that there's nothing or that there's something that gets destroyed. And this can be found in a very important and influential passage of the Kachanagota Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya 12:15, where the Buddha clearly states that we must abandon all ideas and concepts of existence or non-existence. These theories are generally going to be confused about the true nature of things, and they lead to grasping. They lead to certain views about the nature of things, which just create more suffering. So it's best to put aside theories regarding existence and non-existence in any substantial metaphysical sense. The Kachanagota Sutta famously states in what will become a very influential passage for later Buddhist philosophers that everything exists. This is one extreme. Nothing exists. This is the second extreme. Avoiding both, the Buddha teaches Dharma by the middle way. And the main idea here is that the Buddha's metaphysical view is supposed to be a kind of metaphysical middle way between the idea that there's nothing or the idea that there's some substantial, essentially existing, unchanging substance. Now, moving on to ethics, the Buddha emphasized an intentional attitude of non-harming, non-violence, as well as friendly love and caring towards others, as well as to oneself. And this was seen as the most important feature of his religious ethics. He did not see the Brahminical understanding of ethics, which is focused on rituals, or the Shramana view of ethics, which is focused on ascetic denial and non-action. Or he also did not see the ethics which are focused on a deity as being the most important aspects of religious ethics. For him, it was developing certain virtues, certain qualities, as such as love and non-harming. These were seen as the most important elements of ethics for him. This has been interpreted in different ways by modern authors. One way in which it has been interpreted is as virtue eudaimonism, or as a kind of virtue ethics. And Damien Keon has been the main figure who has written about this. And in this interpretation, the Buddhist ethics focuses on developing virtues, and these virtues all derive their value from their capacity to lead us to liberation, to lead us to an ultimate good, an ultimate happiness. J. Garfield has interpreted Buddhist ethics as a more unique kind of moral phenomenology, which focuses on the impact that ethical acts have on our inner experience. I would say that, both of these can be right in their own way. Buddhist ethics is certainly unique but it also bears some similarities to ancient Greek virtue ethics. But I think Garfield is right that perhaps we should treat Buddhist ethics as its own sui generis kind of ethical theory, even if we can compare it in certain ways to other forms of ethical theories, Western ethical theories, anyways. Now, when it comes to epistemology, the field of philosophy focuses on what is knowledge. The best work on this is Jaya Tilake's early Buddhist theory of knowledge. According to Jaya Tilake, the Buddha's epistemology is mainly a kind of correspondence theory, which basically says that what is true because of how it relates to facts about the world. He also states that there are certain coherentist elements within this mainly correspondence view. And of course, this is a kind of modern interpretation of these texts, a modern interpretation which relies on Western philosophy. Jaya Tilake was trained in England in analytic philosophy, so he kind of takes those tools and those ideas and applies it to the early Buddhist texts. It's not like these early Buddhist texts actually use the idea of correspondence in any specific sense, but by citing certain sources like the Apanaka Sutta, he comes up with this idea that it's mainly a kind of correspondence theory. What is true because there are certain facts about the world, and our ideas must match those facts. Other authors have seen a more pragmatic kind of epistemology in the early Buddhist texts. One of these is Kalupahana, another Sri Lankan author and thinker. You can see something like this in the famous Kalama Sutta, which has the Buddha say that we should not rely on oral tradition, which is the common epistemic foundation in Vedanta, the most important religious philosophy in Hinduism. He also says we should not rely on lineage or testimony. We should not rely on scriptures. We shouldn't rely on pure reasoning, pure logical reasoning. The Buddha also says in this text that we shouldn't just rely on our own point of view, on our thinking, on our supposed experts or our teachers, who just because they tell us something does not mean it's true. So he rejects all of these supposed sources of knowledge, and he instead says that we need to rely on our own experience, on our own knowledge of what is wholesome or unwholesome, and what leads to suffering or what leads to the end of suffering. So that last part here is a very pragmatic understanding of what we must rely on for having knowledge. We just have to rely on our own experience. What when we do, and this is mainly aimed at an ethical kind of understanding. What we must believe must also guide us to the ending of suffering. And this has been seen as a kind of pragmatism, kind of Jamesian kind of pragmatism, in where truth isn't just this bare fact about the world, an idea which gives us a bare fact about the world, but it also has ethical and pragmatic considerations that we need to bring to the fold here. And we also see these kinds of pragmatic ideas in certain early Buddhist sources, where the Buddha actually puts aside or brackets certain philosophical questions as just not important. Like pragmatically, these questions would just we don't need to really focus on them. And these include some very important questions in Western philosophy of religion, including whether there was a beginning to the universe, whether there's a God, Ishvara in Sanskrit, which means Supreme Lord, whether the universe is infinite or eternal. These are all, especially cosmological questions like these, the Buddha did not seem to hold that they were very important, and he probably held that they would keep you bound in like constant debate, and you would never get anywhere. in your spiritual practice. So it's just best not to worry about these too much. And there's certain sources like the Chula Malunkyā Sutta, the Samsapa Sutta, which mention this attitude of just putting aside these questions. The parable of the poisoned arrow is found in one of these texts, and basically the idea is that you have someone who gets hit by a poisoned arrow, and a doctor comes to cure him, and instead of just letting the doctor do his work and follow the instructions of the doctor, he wants to know where the doctor came from, what his caste is, what his training was like, and just keeps questioning this doctor about all these different facts about the doctor instead of just letting him and helping him do the work of removing the poisoned arrow and healing the poison. So it seems like for the Buddha, there's at least certain questions that are just not answerable and not important. He called these the imponderable questions. And he said they were a thicket of views, a desert of views, a trap of views, the evasiveness of views, a fetter of views, and they're beset with anguish, distress, and fever. They don't lead to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. That last one is nirvana, extinguishment. It's translating nirvana there. So I guess if you spend a lot of time on YouTube looking about arguments for the existence of God, it seems like, yeah, this is a thicket of views, right? At least in this forum. But yeah, the Buddhist pragmatism here is, of course, not just negative. It also preserves a kind of room for trust or confidence, shraddha, which is also sometimes translated as faith, when dealing with transcendental questions. Since there are certain questions that are important and just can't be put aside, but they cannot be directly known, right? They can't. There's not enough solid evidence for proving one way or the other whether they exist. And the main question here that the Buddha does see as important and yet really difficult to answer in any solid philosophical sense is afterlife questions. So when it comes to that, the Buddha actually provides a kind of wager argument, which is, as far as I know, the first occurrence of a kind of wager argument in the history of philosophy of religion. And you find these kinds of arguments found in the Apanaka Sutta and the Kalama Sutta, and basically the idea is that it's best to believe in an afterlife, that there is some consequence to an afterlife, than not, because this has certain positive consequences in the present life. So even if there is not an afterlife, you'll still have certain positive outcomes that come from believing in the afterlife. And then if it turns out there is an afterlife, then and that view has guided you to acting positively in this life, then there might be also positive outcomes in that afterlife as well. So there's more to that, and it's more complex, obviously, but yeah, he gave a kind of pragmatic wager argument for believing in the afterlife there, which is a question that can't be completely settled by a person who is not enlightened and hasn't had some kind of a direct perception of their past lives and so on and so forth, which the Buddha also held that it was possible, right? But for most people, that was not accessible. Those truths were not accessible. So they had to take a sort of pragmatic approach to answering that question. Another important topic of the Buddha's epistemology here is that there are certain passages which point to the Buddha having a certain kind of virtue epistemology, in which there are certain intellectual virtues that he upheld as being very important in the pursuit of truth. So the pursuit of truth wasn't just something that is done in a systematic fashion, but we need to be constantly developing certain intellectual virtues, and these include, philosophical analysis, mindfulness, being aware of our state of mind at any given time, including when we're having philosophical discussions with people, honesty, anti-dogmatism, and just not clinging to views, including our views, right? That's the most important thing. There are many passages which the Buddha discusses the problem of clinging to views, even if they're the correct views. He also espoused closely scrutinizing authority figures, so-called spiritual teachers or Brahmins, priests, ascetics, and so forth, including himself. There's the Vimamsaka Sutta, the Inquirer Sutra, is a very important source in which the Buddha explains how people should inquire about him and observe closely his own actions and his own statements and scrutinize the things that he says and his ideas. And this is very important throughout Buddhism, the idea that we don't just accept scriptures and the things our teachers say just because they say it, just because they have some kind of authority granted. We have to constantly question them. Other important intellectual virtues, again, friendliness and compassion or caring. These are also important virtues, which are not just standard ethical virtues, but they're important in the pursuit of truth, especially when we're discussing with philosophy with others, and also with ourselves, right? Like when we realize that maybe we made a mistake, not being harsh to ourselves when it comes to these things. So these are all very important intellectual virtues that the Buddha taught. And related to this is the fact that in Buddhism, the self-cultivation is ultimately the goal, right? Philosophy isn't an end to itself, as we discussed this earlier. But the end of the entire Buddhist project is the ending of suffering. And so mindfulness, practicing deep states of meditation, these are arguably even more important than the conceptual and intellectual elements of Buddhist philosophy. So even though, in this video and in other videos, we will be discussing Buddhist philosophy and epistemology and all these complex topics, it must be kept in mind in the background that all of these are meant to be a kind of foundation, a kind of laying the groundwork for the actual work of Buddhism, which is the spiritual practice. A very important topic in modern philosophy of the religion is the existence of God. So this is something we can't just put aside when talking about Buddhist philosophy. In certain passages, the Buddha does just put the question aside, like it's not that important. But in other passages, he does criticize the idea. And one critique that one finds sounds quite similar to the modern problem of evil and those kinds of discussions. And perhaps this is what draws a lot of people to Buddhism, because the Buddha didn't posit the idea of God, a creator God, a supreme Lord of the universe, and he just didn't think it was very important. And in other cases, he rejects the idea. He seems to reject the idea, and yet he teaches an entire spiritual path, an entire religious philosophy that has basically no concern for that question. So that is kind of a unique aspect of Buddhism as a religion, and compared to other major world religions, which are generally all theistic in some way or another. He did, however, affirm an afterlife, which is what Buddhism has in common with the rest of the world religions. And he also affirmed a kind of universal moral law, which is the Buddhist theory of karma. And that theory is mainly based on intention. So karma is mainly mental. It's a mainly mental event that occurs, which has physical effects, but it begins in the mind. And that's how its main mechanism works in Buddhism. And with the theory of karma and rebirth also comes the idea there are many, many worlds, many planes of existence, many different kinds of places where you can be reborn or reincarnated, including heaven realms where there's a lot of happiness but almost no suffering at all, and then other realms where there's like a lot of suffering, and that would be the so-called hell realms, or the lower realms, quote unquote, as they're called in the early text. The main soteriological goal in Buddhism is the idea of the nirvana, the concept of nirvana, which means extinguishment or going out. Like you would say that a flame goes out, you would say a flame nirvanas. So it's kind of like a verb. But mainly the idea here is that it is possible to reach a state of complete cessation of suffering and the causes of suffering. So that is the central idea of nirvana. There's many metaphysical theories about what nirvana is, whether it's some kind of existence or is a kind of non-existence in a certain way, but at the end of the day, the most important thing is the psychological side of nirvana, which is a complete end of suffering. And lastly, we must mention that a lot of these religious ideas are grounded in religious experience, especially the religious experience of the Buddha and the early Buddhists. In the early Buddhist texts, we constantly find appeal to religious experience as a way of explaining these more metaphysical ideas like rebirth and nirvana and so forth. And that can't be ignored, right? It's the Buddhist philosophy isn't just based on reasoning or empirical observation. It's also based on these yogic experiences that one has in meditation and how they were interpreted by the early Buddhist community. Okay, so moving on. The next major stage in the history of Buddhist philosophy is the Abhidharma period. Now, after the Buddha's death, you have his followers who continue the tradition. The Sangha, the Buddhist community, is passing down the teachings of the Buddha and begins to organize these teachings into various textual collections that are initially just passed on orally. Over time, they get written down. But over time, there's also this scholastic system which begins to develop in the various Buddhist communities around India. This is called Abhidharma. It means about the teaching, and it is a highly technical systematization of the Buddhist philosophy, which also significantly expands on the issues that are raised and that arise when one discusses the different points that are found in Buddhist philosophy. It seems like this system developed out of certain early Buddhist discourses and certain lists of doctrines and ideas that are found in the oral tradition. So, we have, when the Buddha gave teachings, apparently he gave teachings sometimes of various lists that he says. There's 5 skandhas, there's 4 noble truths, there's 12 features of dependent arising, and so on and so forth. And some of these lists can get quite large. So perhaps some of these Abhidharma texts developed out of these lists, at least according to certain scholars. And there was also certain commentaries on the sutras that initially, were oral commentaries, and some were written down and survived. So it's also, again, possible that this scholastic system developed out of that. Whatever the case, an important feature of the Abhidharma is this idea of a dharma. So initially, dharma just meant natural law, or just a universal law, a principle, a metaphysical principle. But it also meant the teaching of the Buddha. The Dharma is the teaching of the Buddha. The Buddha Dharma is the teaching of the Buddha. And the Hindu Dharma is the Hindu teaching, the Hindu tradition. But in the Abhidharma, it gets a more technical meaning, which Noah Ronkin explains here as both any category that represents a type of occurrence, as well as any of its particular tokens or instances. It could also be said to be any event, any phenomena, any individual thing that we can talk about is a dharma. And that includes physical dharmas, like just a particular material phenomenon, like an atom or something like that, or mental dharmas, like any particular mental experience. The Abhidharma system is generally a kind of dynamic pluralism, which holds that reality fundamentally at the ground level, it's a kind of series of many particulars, which happen very rapidly in succession, and a kind of staccato moment. So in our minds, there's just constantly changing minute particulars that when we put them all together, we get our mind. But you can divide up our mind into these tiny little moments of experience. And the same thing with matter. Matter is just made up of tiny little atoms and tiny little particulars, and they aggregate together to create the macroscopic objects. And these particulars are the dharmas. There's also different rules with which is how they interact with each other, and through these rules, through these kind of natural laws, the entire world of experience arises. I call this a kind of phenomenal pointillism, and this is not really found in the earliest Buddhist sources, right? This is more of a later development, this kind of more systematized philosophy. The Buddha didn't necessarily talk in this way, but later Buddhists, extrapolating from the teachings of the Buddha, developed this more systematic and reductionistic philosophy, which says that everything is reducible to these tiny particulars. Mark Sideritz calls this mereological reductionism, and that's just basically the idea that only fundamental entities, only these minute particulars, minute momentary particulars are real. Wholes are unreal. And I have a quote here from Jan Westerhoff, also explaining this basic idea. And he says, complexes or wholes, from medium-sized dry goods to complexes consisting of a few dharmas, do not really exist. The only things that do are the underlying parts, the dharmas, which constitute the basis of reality. Wholes do not constitute any addition of being. Talk of them as simply a convenient shorthand for talking about the parts being arranged in a special way. So in Abhidharma, the ultimate reality, the fundamental truth, is really just these dharmas and their relations. Everything else is the conventional truth. Everything else is just conceptual and nominal and doesn't ultimately exist. These particulars and their relations are momentary. This is another important theory in Abhidharma. They're constantly changing moment to moment. They're often compared to like frames on a film reel. You watch a film and it seems like there's a single thing. There's a single film. But really, there's just these frames that are constantly changing really fast. You can't tell just by looking at a film that it's made up of these constant frames. But that's what a film really is. When you get right down to it, it's just light and these frames. And Abhidharma is like that, right? Reality is made up of these constantly changing moments, constantly changing particulars, and our experience of that, which is also constantly changing moment to moment. It seems like a coherent single thing, but it's not when you get right down to it. And in meditation, we can experience that. That's the idea of the Abhidharma system. Now, Abhidharmas disagree on whether all dharmas are momentary or whether only some dharmas are momentary. So, for example, Theravada Abhidharma, physical dharmas are not momentary, but mental dharmas are. In other systems of Abhidharma, all dharmas are momentary. So there's debate that goes on there. Again, this is a new development. This theory of momentariness and the whole Abhidharma scholastic project. In the earliest Buddhist sources, we don't really find such a radical understanding of momentariness and these particulars. There are various Abhidharma schools, and they developed their own lists of dharmas, which was supposed to explain all of reality. So, for example, in the Theravada school, which is still in existence today in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, there are a total of 82 ultimate particulars, or dharmas. There's 53 mental particulars and 28 physical particulars. And then there's also one unconstructed and uncaused dharma, and that is nirvana. So that's a unique category there just for the ultimate goal of Buddhism. So here we have a list of the Theravada system of Abhidharma. As you can see, it's dualistic. It's a kind of interactionist dualism in a sense, in which you have mental dharmas, mental factors, and then you have material dharmas. And these are further divided and categorized in different ways. So, we can see the categories are ethical categories, most of these, right? Like there's wholesome factors, there's unwholesome factors. The wholesome or beautiful factors are the factors that we want to cultivate. So I think an important thing that we can see from looking at this list is it's not just this scholastic philosophical project. It has soteriological import, right? Because this whole system isn't just done for shits and giggles. Like, the reason for this system is that it gives us a map of our own experience. It gives us a map of the world, which we can then take into our meditation. And then, we're sitting in meditation in the forest, and then, we have certain experiences, and we can say, well, we're trying to cultivate the beautiful factors, and we are trying to let go of the unwholesome factors. And we already have that category in our minds because we've studied Abhidharma. When we experience certain factors, we know, this is something that I need to let go of, that I just need to relax and not focus on. And then when we have beautiful factors, we know that we need to cultivate those, So yeah, I mean, it can seem like this very technical and like, why are they doing this? Why are Buddhist philosophers doing this, right? But like, there's a reason for that, right? It provides a map of the mind, a map of experience, which then we can take it into the spiritual path, and it can guide us. So, the Abhidharma, that's what the Abhidharma project is all about. It can get very technical, very, very, there's all these arguments about these minutiae of the dharmas and the categories of the dharmas, but ultimately, this is the main idea behind it, is that we're trying to build the best map we can for our spiritual practice. So, various modern scholars have echoed this basic idea that the Abhidharma is more of a kind of phenomenological map than strictly just a metaphysical theory. And that it was applied as a meditative and soteriological map that could guide people in their contemplative self-development. But as we say today that, the map is not the territory, these Abhidharmikas, they understood that this was a conceptual system that was useful in understanding ultimate reality. It was for them, it was the conceptual system that got you closest to ultimate reality, as close as you could get with the use of language and concepts. But they also understood that it was a map, it was a conceptual model, and ultimately realization of ultimate reality had to happen in a meditative context, and the Abhidharma would guide you to that, but it was not ultimate truth itself. The model of the Abhidharma helps you because it provides various ethical evaluations of various mental phenomena, especially mental phenomena, and tells you what leads to freedom or what leads away from freedom, from liberation, from nirvana. So, using this Abhidharma map, you could start to practice meditation and refer to it back and forth as you're progressing along the path. And ultimately, like the Buddha says in the sutras, you let it go, because it's like a raft, right? You use it to cross the river, but then afterwards you just put it down when you don't need it anymore. These various Abhidharma systems, they also developed complex schemas of conditionality and causality. So, like we had in the previous slide, we had a map of the different dharmas, there's also lists of the different conditional relations that can occur between these different dharmas. And these various Abhidharma thinkers were also mainly nominalists about all things that were not in the list of fundamental particulars, the list of dharmas. Anything that is not in that list is then a conceptual construct based on the dharmas, but not an ultimate existing thing. Now, these ideas all come together into the two truths model of reality. We can understand reality as being able to be broken down into two facts, two matters of fact. One is the ultimate truths. Those are the fundamental particulars. They cannot be broken down further. They are the foundation of all experience and all concepts and all ideas. The second, the conventional truth, are conceptual and nominal truths. And ultimately, they are not real. And what that means is they only arise based on the more fundamental particulars. So they're just not as fundamental as the ultimate truth. They can be broken down and analyzed into further elements or parts. And hence, they're not ultimately true. They're just conventionally true. And, this is a bit like Seller's idea of the scientific image versus the manifest image, right? Like there's a way that we experience the world, and we say there's a car, there's a chair, there's these macroscopic objects, but in the most fundamental of the sciences, such as physics, we don't really talk about those macroscopic objects that much. At least when we're talking about particle physics, right? We're talking about more fundamental things that the macroscopic objects are made out of, and this is the idea that there's this scientific image, which isn't exactly the same as the manifest image that we experience, the world of everyday objects. These Abhidharma schools were also generally dualists about the mind and the body. That is, they thought there were mental phenomena and there were physical phenomena, and they weren't the same thing. However, they were interactionist dualists, so they thought that the mind and the body are deeply interconnected. Mental phenomena and physical phenomena are in a constant interplay of dependency and constantly in contact with each other. So they didn't see it as a problem that you had these two different kinds of ultimate particulars that could interact with each other. It seems like the concern of how these two can interact, the interaction problem, as it's called today, wasn't really something that came up in these discussions of these Buddhist philosophers. They did not seem to think that it was a problem, right? Now, these Abhidharma schools, which we will discuss, the different schools that existed, had many texts, and they defended and discussed all of the foundational Buddhist ideas that we discussed previously, such as not self, anatman, Buddhist ethics, theories of karma and a rebirth, spiritual practice, and the nature of nirvana, and all the dharmas. So there's many Abhidharma texts where all these ideas are discussed in a very technical fashion, and we just can't go into all of that here. But they expanded the Buddhist philosophical discussion into much other terrain that had not been discussed before. And all the concerns and problems that arise when talking about things like not self and karma and rebirth, they discuss many of these. Regarding nirvana, again, it is a special kind of dharma, which is unconditioned and independent, and fully transcendent, and it is neither mental nor physical. And what that means is, of course, the subject of much debate. The nature of nirvana is a highly debated topic also among the different Abhidharma schools. So that's another topic where a lot of debate was happening. And there were many disagreements about what nirvana was. Some schools thought that it was this really existing thing, ultimate existent reality. Others thought that it was more of an absence, a phenomenon which is ending of something, the ending of suffering, and the ending of the stream of personality. So we will briefly discuss the various Indian Buddhist schools that developed during the Abhidharma period. Buddhism, like all religions, eventually split into different sects or schools of thought due to various factors: geographical distance, disagreements on monastic rules, and also on doctrine. The doctrinal disagreements and philosophical disagreements also later played more of a role in these different schisms. A lot of this started happening after the reign of Ashoka, who was a king who patronized Buddhism and united large swaths of India. So he was a very influential ruler and a very influential person in the history of Buddhism. His support of Buddhism led to the spread of Buddhism throughout India and even beyond India. The first major division among the different Buddhist schools was the split between a group of Buddhists called the Elders, the Stavaras, and another group called the Mahasangika, the Great Community. There's a lot of historical debate over like exactly how this happened, but whatever the case, after this split, you have further splits among these different communities over myriad number of topics and issues. In North India and in Kashmir, you had a group called the Sarvastivada Vaibhashika. Some of their main philosophical theories was a kind of direct realism. So they held that we have direct access to the material particulars through our mental phenomena. They affirmed the kind of simultaneous causation, while other schools rejected the idea that there could be a simultaneous causation. And most importantly, they held a theory of block time, four-dimensionalism, or temporal eternalism, as it's sometimes called, which is the idea that the past, the present, and the future are all existent right now. So even though the present is only experienced by us, all of the phenomena in the past and all of the phenomena in the future all still exist in some way. And this is what Sarvastivada means. It means all exists. And this school also had another influential idea, another important idea that would become an important subject of debate. That was the idea that each dharma has an inherent nature or essence, svabhava. And now there's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes about what this svabhava means, because later you have other Mahayana philosophers who are going to critique the doctrine of svabhava. But for the Vaibhashika school, svabhava just means the inherent nature, the inherent characteristic of any individual dharma. Now, that inherent characteristic is still interdependent, because again, these are Buddhists, so they uphold the theory of dependent origination. They believed that it was possible that a particular could have an inherent nature, something that makes it what it is, and that remains the same over time, and yet that inherent nature was also impermanent in some ways and was interdependent, arose through dependent origination and exists as a dependently originated phenomenon. So there's a lot of that goes in here, and we haven't talked about the school that later comes and rejects the idea of svabhava, so we can't get too much into that. But this school is very interesting, and their theory of svabhava isn't, sometimes it's caricatured as being an unchanging, fixed essence, but even though it might be described as an essence, it was still a dynamic essence, because again, they are Buddhists, so they don't think that there's like something that remains completely unchanging and completely fixed. So they held that there were these inherent natures, but they held that they were dynamic and changing. So their theory of essence was very interesting. Um, the main sources for this school, the Vaibhashika school, is the Mahavibhasha. So that's the reason why they're also called Vaibhashika, because they upheld the doctrine that was taught in this great commentary that was written in Kashmir at a Buddhist council in Sanskrit. And a later very important philosopher of the school is Samgabhadra, who wrote some important works on the Vaibhashika philosophy. And this remained a very influential and very powerful philosophical tradition in North India. Now, within the same monastic communities of the Sarvastivada, there were also another group of individuals, of thinkers, and perhaps certain lineages of these thinkers, who were called the Sautrantika. Now, Sautrantika means those who follow the sutras. And it seems like these individuals did not take very well to the Sarvastivada commentaries and their Mahavibhasha specifically, and the doctrines contained in that. So they wrote their own commentaries, their own philosophical works, and they had their own theories about the nature of time and the various Abhidharma doctrines. They specifically rejected the Vaibhashika theory of all exists, of temporal eternalism, in favor of a kind of presentism, in which only the present moment exists. So this was perhaps one of the most important debates in the northern Abhidharma tradition, whether or not eternalism is true or whether presentism is true. And another important disagreement they had with the Sarvastivada school was that they defended a kind of representationalism. So they didn't think that the mind had direct access to external phenomena. They thought that we only experienced a representation that was created by the mind on the basis of the external material dharmas or phenomena, and that this is what we experience when we see the external world and so on. We only see a representation. Another important theory about another important theory of this school that would become very influential for later Mahayana Buddhism and its philosophy is that they held that there was this subtle mind stream which contained seeds, and this was their way of providing personal continuity. All Buddhist schools need to somehow explain how rebirth is possible, especially because they don't hold that there's an essential soul or self that undergoes rebirth. So then you have to explain what is it that undergoes rebirth, or how is there continuity between this life and the next. So for this school, there was a subtle mind that undergoes rebirth, and it contains the seeds of our acts. It contains impressions of all of the actions that we've undertaken, and these impressions later give birth to effects in the next life, like a seed that is planted in the earth and later grows to be a plant after some time. The Vaibhashika school had their own theory of personal continuity, and it was closely related to their doctrine of temporal eternalism, since all of the actions that we have done in the past still exist. Because the past still exists, we have a certain kind of connection with those actions. Even though we're here in the present, those acts that we did in the past, they're still there, and they're still somehow tugging at us in some way. And the present also works in a certain kind of way. So that was their theory of rebirth. So here we have two different theories on the nature of time, and this ties into how they understand rebirth for these two schools. There are different historical figures with different philosophical views for the Sautrantika school, but the most important text and scholar for this tradition is Vasubandhu, who wrote the Abhidharma Kosha. And actually, Vasubandhu is an interesting figure because he was a Sarvastivada. He studied the Sarvastivada system, but then he wrote this work which explains the details of the Sarvastivada system very succinctly, but also critiques it on certain respects. It retains some parts of Sarvastivada, but it also critiques other parts, especially temporal eternalism and so on. So this is actually the Abhidharma text that is studied in Tibetan Buddhism and in Chinese Buddhism still to this day. If you're going to study Abhidharma in those two traditions of Buddhism, you will study this text, the Abhidharma Kosha. Now, the other great branch of Buddhist Abhidharma scholastic philosophy is the Mahasamgika school, the great community. They thrived throughout India. There is no existent tradition of the Mahasamgika today, and we have very few primary sources from this tradition, so there's less we can say with certainty about this school. And just like in the Stavira tradition, we have different sub-schools of the Mahasamgika. One of these, which we know about, was called the Prajñaptivada philosophy. And this seems to have been a kind of radical nominalism or conceptualism, which holds that all phenomena, all dharmas, all of the particulars are just conceptually designated phenomena, prajñapti. So while in some systems of Abhidharma, only the conventional truth is a conceptual designation, for the Prajñaptivada, it seems like they held that all dharmas are conceptual designations. What this exactly means, we're not sure, because again, we don't have many primary sources for this tradition. We just have little bits that we read in certain other texts that talk about the Prajñaptivada and what they have believed and so on. But we don't really have, I believe, like a philosophical treatise by this school. It could have meant that it was similar to the Mahayana school, which holds that all things are empty, or it could have been more like an idealistic tradition. It's really hard to say. Another very influential tradition of the Mahasamgika is the Lokottaravada school, which I translate here as transcendentalists. And what this means is that they believed that Buddhas were fully transcendent beings. And this is a kind of Docetism, if you will, which is similar to Docetic ideas in Christianity, in early Christianity, which held that Jesus never really had an actual human body, and he wasn't human at all. He was completely transcendent being. He only appeared human. And in this way, people around him saw him as walking around and doing all the things that humans do, but actually, he was not human at all. He only did this to perhaps not freak people out or something like that. So the Lokottaravada school holds the same or a similar view, right? The Buddha and all Buddhas are actually fully transcendent beings. They are not human. They only appear to be human, even though they have a body. They walk around. They shit and piss and eat. This was all just a fiction. This is all an illusion. It's an emanation body, a kind of magically created body that came to this world to help people. But his actual true body, his Dharmakaya, is this transcendent, existent, this transcendent being. And an important element of this is, of course, that the Buddha didn't really die when he died, and he's still around, and we can expect future emanations from his transcendent body in the future. And this school also, at least some parts of the school, seem to have believed that there were many Buddhas, not just one, and also many Buddha lands, many transcendent realms where there are Buddhas. So even though today the school doesn't exist, so the only tradition which holds similar views to this is the Mahayana school. There was a non-Mahayana school who held similar ideas, and this was the Lokottaravada. This school also held a idea which helped explain rebirth. It held that there was this root or fundamental consciousness, the Mula Vijnana, that undergoes rebirth. And this is also found in later Mahayana schools. So we can see in a lot of these Mahasangika schools, and a lot of scholars have noted this, that there's certain ideas here which are kind of prefigure Mahayana ideas. And it's possible that Mahayanists took some of these ideas from these early Buddhist schools. They also held that consciousness is naturally self-aware, or that there is reflexive cognition. So any dharma, any phenomena of awareness, any conscious phenomena, is not just aware of its intentional object, but aware of itself. Like a lamp that lights up the room and also lights itself up. And this is also another important doctrine which one finds in later Mahayana. So now we're going to talk about the Theravada school. I'm not going to say much about them because I've explained the basic Abhidharma system, and the Theravada school is a very conservative tradition, and their view of Abhidharma is basically the standard Abhidharma view that I've outlined earlier. But an important thing about the school is that they're the only of these kind of mainstream early Buddhist schools that we find still in existence today. All of the other schools, Sarvastivada, Sautrantika, all of the Mahasangika schools, they've all ceased to exist. Some of their texts survive, and some of and these ideas are still influential, but as an independent philosophical school or tradition, they have ceased to exist. Not so the Theravada. It exists as a major tradition in Sri Lanka, in Southeast Asia, Burma, Thailand. If you go to Burma or Thailand and you study Buddhism, you will study Theravada Buddhism. You will study the Abhidharma, the Theravada Abhidharma, which is a living tradition of philosophy and scholastic Abhidharma study and practice. The Theravada school is a realist school. They affirm the external world exists, and it's made up of particulars, and it's made up of mental particulars and material particulars. So it's a kind of dualism. They are presentists, so they reject the Sarvastivada temporal eternalism or block time theory, that the past and the present and the future exist at the same time. And they also affirm the theory of momentariness, but only about mental dharmas, about mental particulars, not about material phenomena. They also reject the docetic view of the Mahasangika school. And this was one of the big ancient debates between the Theravada school and other traditions. Some of the most important figures in the Theravada are the Moggaliputta Tissa, who was an Indian Theravadan thinker. He is credited to have written the Katavattu. It is a text which discusses many debates. It's actually one of the most important sources for the various doctrines of the early Buddhist schools, such as the Docetism of the Mahasangika and the temporal eternalism and so on and so forth. This is a text which discusses all of these views and attempts to refute them all and just defend a kind of Theravada view of the Abhidharma. Perhaps the most influential of the philosophers and scholars of the Theravada is Buddhaghosa. He was an Indian who then moved to Sri Lanka and wrote various texts which are now the orthodox system of Theravada Abhidharma. If you study Theravada today in like Burma and in other, perhaps in Sri Lanka, you will the works of Buddhaghosa they loom large in the tradition. He's a bit like, their Aquinas or their Plato, right? And yeah, I mean, there's not much to say because even though it's still a lively and interesting tradition, and a lot of development has happened, especially in the modern world, in the modern era. There's been, kind of Buddhist modernism, and lots of changes have happened throughout most of its history until the relatively recent 20th century, 19th century. Theravada has remained quite stable. Its doctrine has remained quite stable, um, and grounded in basic Abhidharma theories that I've outlined. So I feel like I should say perhaps a bit more about the Theravada, but philosophically speaking, it is an Abhidharma tradition, as I've explained. The next major school that I will discuss is the Pudgalavada, who were a very influential school in their time, but no longer exist. They were dominant in the area around Gujarat, and they had a large monastic institution there at Vallabhi. This tradition is unique because they developed a much more robust and non-reductionist theory of personal identity, which they called the Pudgala. So even though they rejected a self, like all Buddhists do, they held that there was something that makes a person what it is, and that is the Pudgala, the person. And this person is a real existent thing, a real existent individual who is neither the same nor different from the five aggregates, the psychophysical elements of personality. And it was also not just a conceptual designation. It was not just a concept that we apply to the five aggregates. It was something else. And what this something else was, it's hard to say, because again, we don't have many primary sources. We have a few in Chinese, but that's about it. The most information we have about the Pudgalavada comes from other texts that reject the Pudgalavada view and try to refute it. So the Abhidharma Kosha does this in a certain, in a specific section that is devoted to this specific topic of the Pudgala. So they were like widely attacked by other schools who were much more reductionist in their theory of personal identity. But they had a sophisticated metaphysical theory of personality, so they were a very interesting tradition, and it should be discussed more. So the next movement that we are going to discuss is possibly the most influential of all Buddhist philosophical traditions in the history of Buddhism after the Abhidharma tradition, and that is the Mahayana, the Great Vehicle. So around the 1st century BCE, you start getting some new innovative Buddhist scriptures appearing on the scene. These are sometimes called the extensive or Vaipulya scriptures, and a bit later they start to be called the Great Vehicle or Mahayana scriptures. Now, these scriptures were not accepted by all Buddhist communities. In fact, that seems to have caused many more schisms in both the Mahasamgika and in the Stavira communities. Some Buddhists just rejected them outright as not being authentic. Like, this doesn't agree with the scriptures that we have. So they just rejected them outright. And others did embrace them, but originally they were in the minority. So we have little archaeological evidence for the Mahayana. But after the 5th century, we start getting much more archaeological evidence. The 5th century CE, we get much more archaeological evidence, more textual evidence. It looks like the manuscripts begin to multiply exponentially after that period. And even though they remained a minority for a while afterwards, they begin to rival other schools in influence and just the sheer amount of texts and historical evidence we have for them. So they after that period, they were growing very quickly. By the 5th century, we have some institutions like Nalanda being founded, and later in the 8th century, we have another large monastic institution called Vikramashila, and the background image of this slide is a picture of Nalanda. So you could see there were very large monks' quarters, debate grounds, classrooms, and other buildings in this large institution of higher learning, this ancient university. And these Mahayana, mainly Mahayana institutions, were some of the largest institutes of higher learning in the ancient world. So they were a very influential intellectual tradition in India. Now, the key ideas, the most important elements of Mahayana Buddhism is the doctrine of universal care, karuna, and emptiness, shunyata. I use care for karuna, even though it almost always gets translated as compassion, because, and here I'm following Jay Garfield, because compassion, what it literally means is suffering with. And there's this general idea that when you have compassion, you kind of feel the pain that others are feeling. But karuna is not really like that. Karuna is more like this active sense of caring. You see others suffering and you want to do something to help them. This virtue already existed in non-Mahayana Buddhism, in Abhidharma. It was one of the virtues that the Buddha taught. But it gets exalted in Mahayana as the most fundamental aspect of the religious path. Likewise, emptiness becomes the most fundamental metaphysical principle in the Mahayana, and we'll discuss that a bit in later parts of this lecture. The central feature of the Mahayana is the ideal of the Bodhisattva. This is a spiritual hero, a being. So sattva can either mean being or it can also mean hero, like a heroic being. And bodhi means awakening. So here it has connotations of a person, a being, a heroic individual who is working to attain awakening, working to attain Buddhahood in this case. And the Bodhisattva was not something that is unique to Mahayana. So already in the non-Mahayana traditions, in the Abhidharma traditions, you had this idea that there are different ways of practicing the spiritual path. One way is that you can work out your own salvation and escape the cycle of life and death and the cycle of suffering, and not really worry about other people that much. Just work on your own salvation. The other ideal was the ideal of the Bodhisattva, who was working towards becoming a Buddha. And when you become a Buddha, you are able to teach the path to others. You're able to guide others to the path. And this was seen as being, that was something that was mainly, only a few people could attain it. Select elite would be able to attain Buddhahood, but it was extremely rare. And most people should really just focus on their own salvation, not on others. But the Mahayana turns this around and says, actually, we should reject the idea that we should just practice the spiritual path for our own salvation. In fact, everyone should try to become a bodhisattva, and everyone should work towards becoming a Buddha for the sake of others. That should be the goal that all follow. And that is mainly the main difference between the Mahayana and the other Buddhist traditions. It's not that only in the Mahayana you get the idea of the Bodhisattva. That is not true. The idea of the Bodhisattva is found in all other Buddhist Abhidharma traditions in ancient India. What makes the Mahayana unique is the idea that if you develop the right attitude, the right intention, then you can be a bodhisattva. Whereas in other traditions, they held that to become one of these bodhisattva beings, these beings that are on the spiritual path to becoming a Buddha, you had to meet a Buddha. You had to meet a living Buddha. And you had to take a vow in front of them to become a Buddha. And the Buddha had to give you a prediction that you would become a Buddha. And then you were on the path to be a bodhisattva. So for most of the Abhidharma schools, the idea that you could just develop the intention, right, to be become a Buddha, they thought that wouldn't make you a bodhisattva. But in Mahayana, you just have to have the right intention. If your heart is in the right place, then you're a bodhisattva. For the other schools, that's not possible. There's certain things you need to do. have to meet a Buddha. So these two contrasting views on the spiritual path are explained in Mahayana as two forms of spiritual two different paths, right? So there's the Shravakayana path, which is also called the Hinayana path. And this is a path of soteriological individualism, right? Everyone should focus on their own liberation. You look out for yourself and you find the way out of suffering by yourself. You can help others along the way in certain ways, of course, but mainly only you can liberate yourself. No one can liberate somebody else. So what's the point of like going through all this rigmarole of trying to save other people, right? Only they can do it themselves. So it's on them. Now, the Mahayana accepts that you can't liberate somebody else. Like, just, you can't do it for them. They still have to do it. But they still have this kind of more universalist soteriology, in which one still should assume the responsibility of guiding others towards liberation. There's many things that one can do to help others attain liberation, to help others free themselves from suffering. And one should do that as part of our path. And this, in fact, helps us on our own path to liberation as well. It's a mutually reinforcing practice. The development of compassion and caring helps our own self-development in our own path. Now, the defining quality of the bodhisattva in the Mahayana tradition is this quality that's called bodhicitta. Now, that means the mind aimed at awakening. It just means, literally, bodhi is awakening and chitta is mind or heart mind. It's not just like the intellectual mind, but it's also the emotional side. So sometimes, you could translate that as heart mind, as some people translate the Chinese word for mind as heart mind as well. So this is the defining quality in Mahayana. This is what makes one a bodhisattva. If you've developed this quality of bodhicitta, then you are a bodhisattva. Even if you're not far along on the path, you're still a bodhisattva. And this mind that is aimed at awakening is a mind, it's a mind that's aimed at awakening not just for ourselves, but for all beings. So this is a motivation that is expanded and should be expanded to focus on all beings, all sentient beings. And Mahayana Buddhists take this quite literally as meaning all sentient beings in the entire universe, in the entire cosmos. This expansion of our intent to reach awakening then covers the entire universe. And that is why it's called the Mahayana, the great vehicle, right? Because the spiritual path then becomes this kind of expansive vehicle where all beings are kind of on the same boat, if you will. We're on the same boat together and we can't abandon each other. We have to help each other as much as we can. J. Garfield gives the following definition of bodhicitta. He calls it an altruistic aspiration to attain full awakening, not in order to alleviate his or her own dukkha, but rather to liberate all sentient beings. So the individual becomes decentered in this spiritual intention, and rather all other beings become the focus of our spiritual intent to reach awakening. And this is supposed to help us in many different ways on the path. It helps us develop wisdom. It helps to better to see not self, actually. So there's a lot of ideas in Mahayana, and there's a lot of discussions in Mahayana of how the bodhicitta and how the care, the compassion, links up with the wisdom and the understanding of not self. And Mahayanists, they're not content with the Abhidharma, non-Mahayanic understanding of the spiritual path. They think that the goal of the Arhat, which is a goal that was taught in the early Buddhist traditions, that we should just focus on our own liberation, and after we become liberated, we just go out like a flame, and we kind of Mahayana sees this as kind of abandoning sentient beings. Like, okay, you've reached liberation, but what about everyone else here, right? What about all these sentient beings who have been your mothers and have been your fathers and they've been your sons and daughters throughout, beginningless time through the cycles of reincarnation? In the Mahayana understanding, this lacks compassion. So then, for the Mahayanists, we should keep coming back to this world to help others, even if it means continuing to reincarnate for eons. And they take this quite literally, right? And this is what makes the Bodhisattva a spiritually and ethically heroic person, because they don't care if they don't achieve enlightenment for eons. They will keep coming back to help others until they are ready to become a Buddha. And then, even when they become a Buddha, they will still stick around, at least according to certain Mahayana understandings of what Buddhahood means. So this is actually quite a radical reinterpretation of the early Buddhist understanding of the spiritual path, which mainly held that after you reach nirvana, you do not reincarnate. You're done. You don't come back at all. So there's a kind of more deeply altruistic ethic that is at the foundation of this Mahayana philosophical tradition, and it's all seen as an ethic that decenters self-interest, and that instead becomes our intention to practice the spiritual path becomes refocused on the rest of the cosmos, all living beings throughout the cosmos. And the idea here is that the less self-centered that you become, the more you develop this compassionate attitude of wanting to help others, the freer that you become, actually. But also there's kind of a feedback loop, because you're helping others and they become more free. So you're helping them out, and that also helps you out on your spiritual path. So there's this interdependent character of the liberative process. So, the Mahayana has this very interesting understanding of emptiness, and how emptiness is closely interlocked with the compassionate attitude of bodhicitta. And this is at the core of Mahayana. Now, Mahayana metaphysics can be described as a kind of universal illusionism. And what I mean by this is all things in the universe, all phenomena, are seen as being illusory in Mahayana. And that means that they are not how they appear. They appear a certain way, but that is deceptive, right? And so I have this picture here, this optical illusion. It appears to be moving. You look at it and it seems to be in motion, but it's not in motion, actually. It's an optical illusion. So it appears a certain way, but it is not that way. It is not a GIF. It's just a static image. And this is also tied to the Mahayana theory of emptiness, which is a kind of universal non-substantialism. All phenomena are seen as empty of self-existence. They are seen as empty of any independence or any essence. And this is how Mahayana understands dependent arising. It's a kind of more radical idea of dependent arising. This emptiness, this universal emptiness, is explained and is interpreted in different ways, and we will see later how the different Mahayana schools explain it. But in a general way, in the Mahayana scriptures, it just means that all things are dependent, and all things are mentally constructed in some way. Nothing exists essentially on its own. And the Prajnaparamita Sutra uses various metaphors, such as the idea that all dharmas are like a magical illusion, and that all dharmas are like a dream. And many such metaphors and illustrations are found throughout the Buddhist sutras. Now, while most Abhidharma traditions understood that the various fundamental particulars exist substantially, and they have a unique essential characteristic or intrinsic nature, Mahayana completely rejects this idea. All of their scriptures will say that all dharmas lack svabhava, intrinsic natures. Instead, they see all phenomena as being without essence, without any core, anything that is metaphysically independent, or anything that is unchanging. And this emptiness is applied to everything, which is a radical move that Mahayana makes, because other Buddhist schools might say, yes, well, everything is dependently arisen. All dharmas are dependently arisen, except nirvana. Nirvana is an unconditioned, completely a kind of essence, if you will, even though it doesn't use those. Buddhists wouldn't use, Abhidharma Buddhists wouldn't use that term. It's unconditioned, unconstructed, eternal, existent reality. At least some Buddhist Abhidharma traditions would say that. They wouldn't say, for example, that nirvana is empty, some kind of unreal, dreamlike thing, right? They would say, no, nirvana is real. It is, in some cases, they would say it is the only thing that is real. But the Mahayana would say, no, actually, even nirvana, even Buddhahood is like a dream. And this is what the Prajna Paramita says, right? It says, the Prajna Paramita Sutra says, even Buddhahood is like a dream. Even Buddhahood is like an illusion. And generally, this can be understood as saying even Buddhahood, even nirvana is interdependent. Even nirvana has no unchanging core or fixed essential existence. Now, regarding the practical side, Mahayana holds that emptiness can be understood. We can train ourselves to see this truth by using various Buddhist methods, various meditations and contemplations and so on, to achieve a radical cognitive shift in the way we experience the world. We generally don't experience the world as being empty, and if we come to believe that the world is empty, then we need to train ourselves to experience that reality. And that's where the various methods that one finds in Mahayana Buddhism come in. The goal here is to achieve what is called the perfection of wisdom, prajna paramita. This is a deep, non-conceptual and intuitive kind of wisdom or knowledge that is transcendental, and it takes you to the other side. Paramita has been interpreted as meaning that which takes you to the other side, that which helps you transcend the regular everyday way we see the world. It is not a kind of conceptual or propositional knowledge, but rather a non-conceptual experiential realization. This prajna paramita, this kind of wisdom, manifests as a kind of inner freedom, non-grasping, a sense of selflessness, and also as compassion and caring for others. And that's because this wisdom is actually not a different thing than caring and universal love for all beings. They're actually one thing, at least according to certain traditions of Mahayana. The wisdom and the compassion are two ways of talking about the same phenomenon, the same kind of virtue. And when we realize the highest states of this Mahayana path, we will understand that there's a deep unity between wisdom and karuna and care. Another important part of Mahayana Buddhism is that it has a much more extensive cosmology than early Buddhism, which already has a very extensive cosmology. There's many realms and many worlds and so on. But in Mahayana, at least they say that the universe is practically infinite. It is limitless. Certain scriptures say that the universe is limitless. There's many world systems, and most importantly, there are many awakened beings. There are many Buddhas. There are an infinite number of Buddhas, basically, in Mahayana. And also there are many bodhisattvas. Not just everyday bodhisattvas that have just started practicing the path, but there's very high level bodhisattvas that are basically like these kinds of angelic, supernormal beings that have all sorts of powers and abilities that are almost unimaginable. So there's a much more expanded mythos in Mahayana with all that talks about all these bodhisattvas and all the things that they've done and so on and so forth. And the mythology is very intricate. So now we get to the most important philosopher of Indian Buddhism after the Buddha, or of Buddhism in general. Nagarjuna is probably the most influential philosopher after the Buddha himself. He's like the Plato in Mahayana Buddhism, or the Aquinas of Mahayana Buddhism. Every Mahayana Buddhist tradition looks to Nagarjuna and his texts. His magnum opus is the root verses of the Middle Way, Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, and there's also other texts that he wrote. And his works provide a systematic exposition and analysis of the theory of emptiness. Most Mahayana scriptures are religious texts, so they explain emptiness through various poetic and religious statements, various analogies, metaphors, various assertions. But what Nagarjuna does is he takes the idea of emptiness and he gives it a more philosophical exposition. He uses philosophical argumentations, especially he relies on reductio ad absurdum arguments to show that any application of the concept of svabhava, essence, intrinsic nature, inherent existence, independence, any such idea is going to lead to some kind of absurd or unwanted conclusion. And that's his main project, to show that essences don't work, that they have many philosophical problems. I have a quote here from Nagarjuna, which sort of gives a basic idea of what he understands to be emptiness. He says, "We state that conditioned origination, or dependent arising, is emptiness. It is a mere designation depending on something, and it is a middle way. Since nothing has arisen without depending on something, there is nothing that is not empty." So for Nagarjuna, dependent arising and the theory of emptiness are two ways of talking about the same thing, is what he's saying in this verse here. And the modern philosopher Graham Priest, who also has written things on Buddhist philosophy, he explains the basic idea here as everything is what it is only in relationship to other things. So there's a strong, perhaps you could call it relationalism, going on in this philosophy. Now, modern scholars of Nagarjuna have given various interpretations using modern philosophical terms. They've said that Nagarjuna's philosophy is a kind of agnosticism, a kind of skepticism, metaphysical relativism, nominalism, ontological nihilism, deconstructivism, dialetheism, and ontological anti-foundationalism. I think that last one is a bit closer to what is going on in Nagarjuna. Of course, these are all like Western philosophical terms, so it's best to just read Nagarjuna and like see what he says. But the modern scholar Jan Westerhoff is the one that explains Nagarjuna as being a kind of anti-foundationalism, and I think he's closer there to what's going on in Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna's philosophy is definitely a radical kind of philosophy. It's anti-essentialist, so there are no essences. There's nothing that exists independently, and there's no foundation to knowledge or to metaphysics. So all essences, all foundations are rejected in Nagarjuna. And this idea, this term emptiness, is just that very fact that all phenomena, all things are empty of essence or of inherent existence, of independence. It is the fact that all things are dependent and conditioned, and that nothing exists on its own, apart from everything else. Everything exists in a web of causal dependency. And this includes all things, all phenomena, all Buddhist teachings and ideas, including the self, Buddhahood itself, time, space, change, knowledge, nirvana, and even emptiness. Emptiness is not some kind of ground of being or anything like that, or Platonic plenum, or monistic substance, nothing like that. Emptiness is just the fact that things are dependent and that things lack an essence. So what does this mean? So if we take a everyday object, a table, a chair, whatever, and we try to analyze it mereologically, metaphysically, according to Nagarjuna, what we will find is that this does not exist. It doesn't exist independently of its parts. It is empty. It also doesn't exist independently of other objects and phenomena that are not the chair. So that's also part of its emptiness. But what is this thing that is called emptiness? Well, it's nothing but that very lack of independent and substantial existence. It's nothing but the dependency of the conventional object that we are looking at. So emptiness is just another way of describing the conventional. That emptiness is also empty as existing as some substantial thing. Emptiness isn't a thing. It's just a fact. It's a conventional fact about the world. And this has been described by a modern philosopher and interpreter of Buddhist philosophy, Mark Sideritz, as the idea that the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth, which I love, right? And if you understand what I mean by this, then you'll understand the meme that I have in this page, right? Because emptiness is the ultimate truth, yes, but actually, it's also conventional, because Nagarjuna's teaching of emptiness is also not some ultimately existing thing, so it is also empty. Now, Nagarjuna has often been misinterpreted as being a kind of nihilism that says that nothing exists. That is not true. Nagarjuna would not say that things, that facts and that knowledge does not exist. He would say that there are things, there are conventional objects, there are facts, there is knowledge that we can have. They're just not essential. They're not substantial. They exist only as dependent and as relative realities. And this is what it means for things to exist as conventional truth. We can see that there are appearances that we have. We experience the world in a certain way, and we can talk about the conventional realities, but they don't exist in any essential way, in any independent way. It's all just a web of relations. Both of these perspectives, the conventional perspective in which we understand the world through just the way we experience it, through everyday objects and relationships, and the ultimate perspective in which we understand things as being empty of those very apparent realities, both of these are important. And Nagarjuna says so in his Mula Karaka. He says, without relying on convention, the ultimate fruit is not taught. Without understanding the ultimate, nirvana is not attained. And this is Nagarjuna's understanding of the two truths theory, which we already saw in Abhidharma. He's just rejecting the idea that the two truths are these metaphysical levels of reality. He says, no, they're just different ways of understanding the dependency of everyday objects and everyday experience. This emptiness is also applied by Nagarjuna to epistemology. His epistemology is also a kind of anti-foundationalism. There's no foundation to knowledge. He rejects the Hindu Nyaya school, which has a kind of foundationalism for knowledge, also in his various philosophical works. And he says, if your objects are well established through epistemic instruments, tell us how you establish this. If you think they are established through other epistemic instruments, there's an infinite regress. If these are established even without other epistemic instruments, what you say is ruined. So what he's basically saying here is that you will never be able to establish a foundation for knowledge. So even though we can use various tools to gain knowledge, and we can use various tools to understand the world, various forms of epistemology, ultimately you can't ground them on anything. So we should just see them as what they are. They're just constructs, human constructs, that help us navigate the world. And that's it. Another important feature of the philosophy of Nagarjuna is that he heavily relies on this tool, this logical tool called the Katishkoti, the four corners or the four positions is what that Sanskrit term means. And he uses this to construct various reductio ad absurdum arguments. And the Katuskoti says, this is the form of the Katuskoti. It's either a phenomenon either exists or it does not exist, both or neither. And those are the four corners. And Nagarjuna will use this and basically try to argue that none of the four alternatives are work in any way when it comes to ideas about the self, ideas about time, all metaphysical ideas. He will use this tool to critique those ideas. Graham Priest, a modern author on logic, has argued that Nagarjuna seems to be arguing for a kind of dialetheism with his Katushkoti, but not all interpreters of Nagarjuna think that he's saying that there are true contradictions, which is what dialetheism means in logic. So that's another interesting feature of Nagarjuna's work. Now, it's easy to get the idea that Nagarjuna was a completely negative thinker, but he actually didn't reject all the classic Buddhist doctrines. He affirmed all the classic Buddhist doctrines, including certain Abhidharma ideas, which we find in his works. And he also didn't completely reject the epistemological tools that are found in the Nyaya school of Hindu philosophy, and that were also later adopted in different ways by Buddhists. He just didn't think that these ideas had any ontological or epistemic foundation. So he's not just a completely negative thinker. And he did believe all of the classic Buddhist ideas and so on. In Nagarjuna's system, the reason we suffer is because we are superimposing essential existence on the phenomena that we experience, on things. And this leads us to cling and to grasp to these things. This includes our perception of ourselves, our perceptions of others, and our perceptions of various experiences. So for Nagarjuna, like any Buddhist, his philosophical system is supposed to help us disentangle ourselves from the cognitions that lead to our suffering, the mistakes that we make in our thinking and our way of experiencing the world. Nagarjuna's philosophy, Madhyamaka, is supposed to help us correct all of the mistakes that we make and all of the distorted ways in which we experience the world. And it's supposed to help us to practice the path and to let go. And in this quote I have here, Nagarjuna says that liberation, moksha, results from the cessation of actions, karma, and defilement, klesha. Actions and defilement result from conceptualization, vikalpa. And this comes from mental proliferation, prapancha. Conceptualization stops in emptiness. So again, we see the return of a theme that we've seen throughout Buddhist philosophical history. All the Buddhist theories that we are going to discuss and that we've been discussing, they're all useful, or they're meant to be soteriologically useful in some way. They're supposed to help us on the path to awakening in some way. It's not just a theory about how the world exists. It's a theory that is supposed to spiritually guide us towards more freedom. And Nagarjuna's middle way philosophy is no different. And a part of this is that Nagarjuna says that his very teaching, that very theory and doctrine of emptiness, if it could be called that, is also empty. And that the goal of him teaching that is to go beyond all concepts and all views. Even the view of emptiness. And also, emptiness is also empty. So it's not something we can hold on to as an essential existent thing or as a foundation. For Nagarjuna, making another doctrine or another dogma out of emptiness is like incorrectly seizing a snake or mistakenly practicing a magic spell. This is actually a quote from Nagarjuna. So emptiness shouldn't be seen as another dogma that we hold on to. It is more like medicine that we take to cure us of a certain disease. And once we've taken that medicine and it's cured us, then we don't need to keep holding on to that medicine or to use that medicine. Of course, what that means is we would be fully enlightened, right? We would be complete Buddhists. So until then, we need to take the medicine. Nagarjuna's work led to a tradition of Buddhist philosophy called Madhyamaka, which can be translated as middle way, the middling school, the centrist school. And a group of philosophers in medieval India continue to comment and expand on Nagarjuna's philosophy. And this includes thinkers like Aryadeva, Buddhapalita, and later thinkers that we will discuss in this presentation. Okay, so now we move on to the next major philosophical school of Mahayana Buddhism, which is the Yogacara school, the Yoga Praxis school. This school is also called Vijnana Vada, the consciousness view, and the mind-only school, Chittamatra. The main figures of this tradition are two brothers, Asanga and Vasubandhu, who lived at some point in between the 4th and the 5th century CE, and were born in modern Peshawar, Pakistan. There's also another figure that is kind of hard to pin down. Goes by the name of Maitreya, which is also the name of a Buddhist bodhisattva who is, one of these transcendental beings that is venerated throughout Mahayana Buddhism. And, according to legend, Maitreya, the actual Bodhisattva Maitreya, transmitted a series of texts to Asanga via, dreams or visions or however, or who knows. And, of course, scholars don't know whether to say, some scholars say that Maitreya was actually like a person and who was the teacher of Asanga. Others say that, it was just, Asanga just had certain visions and he attributed certain texts that he wrote to the Bodhisattva Maitreya. There's a lot of scholarly disagreement on this, of course. Another problem is that there's a set of 5 texts that are attributed to Maitreya in the Tibetan tradition, but in the Chinese tradition, there's another set of 5 texts that are different, that are also attributed to the same figure as transmitted through Asanga. And the two traditions only agree on 2 texts. The other 3 texts each lists different sets of texts. But they do agree that the Mahayana Sutralamkara and the Madhyanta Vibhaga were taught by Maitreya to Asanga. Whatever the case, we have these texts. Regarding the text that Asanga Vasubandhu himself wrote, Asanga also said to have written another set of texts. His most important work is the Mahayana Samgraha, the compendium of the Mahayana. Vasubandhu, there's also a lot of disagreement on what he wrote or what he didn't write, and but there's a set of texts that are generally agreed upon as being by Vasubandhu that expound the Yogacara philosophy. The key doctrine of the school is the Vinyapti Matra doctrine, which could mean something like consciousness only, ideation only, appearance only. Vinyapti generally is something that appears in the mind, something which is mental. And there's two quotes here from Vasubandhu and Asanga, respectively, that sort of give you an idea of what this central teaching of the Yogacara school is. So first, Vasubandhu's 20 verses says, "This world is only appearance, since it manifests itself as an unreal object, just like the case of those with cataracts seeing unreal hairs in the moon, and the like." And Asanga similarly says, "These appearances are just appearances, vinyapti matra, because there is no corresponding object. Just as in a dream, there appear images of all kinds of things without a referent. These appear in the mind alone." So this gives you an idea of what vinyapti matra means. It means that when you get right down to it, the world that we experience is just these appearances in our minds. Just like when we're in a dream, we see all these different appearances, we see all these different images, but according to these thinkers, there's nothing but the appearances. Realist philosophers might say there's the appearance, but these appearances are representations of external objects, or these appearances are how we experience external objects, but there is something that the appearances are about. For the Yogacara school, at least what they seem to be saying is, no, we can explain the world just as appearances, just as these images, as these conscious experiences. We don't need to then posit that there's something else other than the appearances. So the philosophy then goes from there and expands on this idea. So what does this mean? What does it mean that the world we experience is like someone who has like an eye disease and who sees hairs in the visual field, but there's no real hairs there. We're just projecting. What we see are just our own projections. Well, there's different interpretations of this by modern thinkers. Some modern scholars of Yogacara think that this is a kind of metaphysical idealism. It's what it sounds like. It's a kind of Berkeleyan idealism. There's just mind. There's no matter. There's no external world. It's just mental phenomena. Of course, unlike Berkeley, there's no God that is doing the holding together of all the different mental perceptions and all the different mental phenomena. It's just mental phenomena, and the interdependent relationships between the different sentient beings who are all interacting with each other in a mutually created world. But it's all mind. Other thinkers, other modern scholars, compare this more to a kind of Kantianism in the sense that it's an epistemic idealism. It may not necessarily be making an ontological or metaphysical claim that there's no external world. It's merely saying we cannot know. All we can know is that there are these vinyaptis, there are these appearances, there are these experiences that we have, and that's all we can say, that's all we can know. Anything else is extra. There's also certain modern interpreters who say, well, we can also see Yogacara as a kind of phenomenology. That it's not making epistemological claims necessarily, it's not making metaphysical claims. It's just giving us a phenomenological analysis of experience, and it's bracketing the existence of the external world. So it doesn't necessarily have an opinion on the existence of anything outside of the phenomena we experience. It just says, look, let's just not talk about that. Let's just focus on what we experience. That's the only thing we have access to, anyways. And so this has been compared to, kind of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. And then there's other, which I think is kind of my favorite way of thinking about this is, I mean, look, we can compare it to certain forms of Western philosophical movements, but we should really see it as its own thing. It is a kind of idealism, but it's its own kind of idealism, and we should take it on its own merits without necessarily starting out by saying, "Oh yeah, this is like Hegel, this is like Berkeley, this is like Kant." Um, Jonathan Gold, in his book on Vasubandhu, calls the Yogacara metaphysics a kind of conventionalist idealism. And he basically says, like, look, it's true that we might be able to compare it to certain kinds of Western idealism, mainly like Kant and so on and so forth. But it's also true that these thinkers do seem to be idealists metaphysically. They seem to think that only it is really just mind that exists. However, their understanding of ultimate reality is also said to be an inconceivable thusness or suchness, which is completely beyond words and concepts. So actually, for the Yogacara school, we can't really say that ultimate reality is mental. Its ultimate reality is actually transcends all concepts, similar to how Nagarjuna and other Buddhist thinkers think. So their idealism is true on the conventional level, but it's not really something that they would say it's true ultimately. Ultimately, we can't say what ultimate reality is. It has to be experienced in meditation. And so, also they're called the Yogacara school because a lot of their texts also focus on, meditative practice and experience. And it was said that these philosophers were also very accomplished practitioners of meditation. So the fact that their school is called Yogacara also gives us a hint to what they thought. Ultimately, their philosophy would give us a framework for practicing, but we would practice certain yogic disciplines and meditation, and then we would see the ultimate truth, and that would be our experience of ultimate truth would be the final end goal of our philosophical endeavor. So their idealism is only true conventionally. That's why Jonathan Gold calls it conventionalist idealism, and I think this makes the most sense of what's going on in Yogacara. Even though we could compare it to Kant in a certain way, and also to phenomenology, because they provide a very complex phenomenological system and a complex way of analyzing consciousness and how cognition works and so on. So I think these comparisons aren't completely off the mark, but they're also not doing justice to the uniqueness of the Yogacara philosophy. So what are the actual arguments that these philosophers make for their view? Well, Vasubandhu, in his 20 verses, says that, look, you can explain our experience without referring to external objects, without referring to matter, and all these ideas. You can just, all you need is mind and mental phenomena. And he says, look, in a dream, there are no external objects. There are no objective reference. There's just mental phenomena. And yet, we seem to experience a world that has spatio-temporal continuity. Things seem to be in a specific place. We go over there, we can touch them, we can feel them. And even though it's slightly weirder in a dream and they change in slightly different ways that things change in the external world, it's still possible to construct the world by just using mental phenomena. Likewise, in dreams have a causal efficacy as well. In fact, they have causal efficacy not just inside of a dream, but actions in a dream can also have causal efficacy outside of the dream. So you can have a wet dream. You can experience having sex in a dream, and then you wake up and something has happened in the real world, so to speak. So, for Vasubandhu, there's just no need to posit external phenomena to explain spatio-temporal continuity and to explain causal efficacy. Likewise, intersubjective agreement can be achieved by just thinking about mental phenomena affecting other mental phenomena, and a certain mind stream affecting another mind stream, a certain person's mind affecting another person's mind. And it can also be explained by saying that there are certain shared cognitive and subconscious elements and behaviors and mental phenomena that are shared across different minds and sentient beings, and therefore they see the same world. They look at I look at a tree and somebody else looks at the same tree, and we don't need to say, well, there's a tree outside of our mind. According to Yogacara, you can just explain that as saying, well, there's certain phenomena that are in their minds, and we also share a certain kind of phenomena in our mind. So when we come together, we say we're seeing the same thing, but we don't need to posit some external object out there that we're both looking at. And Vasubandhu uses the example of a collective hallucination. He thinks that specifically there's certain Buddhist hells where people have certain hallucinatory experiences. And he says, look, this is an example of people having a collective hallucination. We don't need to, if we want intersubjective agreement, well, here's an example of an intersubjective agreement that doesn't have an external reference. So he says, all of these are various examples that we can use to show that we don't need external phenomena to explain the world that we experience. Because of this, he appeals to simplicity, which is in Indian philosophy is called the principle of lightness, which is basically like Occam's razor. And he just says, well, since we can explain the world of experience by just through using mental phenomena, I'm not going to bother then introducing material phenomena into my system, external phenomena into my system. There's no point in doing that. I'm going to keep my system as simple as possible, as light as possible. Positing external material things, it's unnecessary. So I'm not going to do that. So that's kind of the basic philosophical reason that Vasubandhu gives for the mind-only view. There's also another important Yogacara source, which I haven't discussed. This is the Arya Sandhi Sutra, the Noble Sutra of the explanation of the profound secrets. This is the Mahayana scripture, not necessarily, but it's a very philosophical text. If you read it, it's highly technical, and it explains the Yogacara philosophy in a very, very complex and technical way. The most important idea of this scripture that I want to share is that according to the Yogacara school, this doctrine, this teaching, which says that everything is just a mental creation, this is the so-called third turning. And this is the final and definitive teaching of the Buddha, according to the scripture. All other teachings, including all of the Abhidharma teachings, all of the non-Mahayana teachings of the scriptures, of the early Buddhist scriptures, all of the Prajnaparamita sutras, and all the other Mahayana teachings, they're provisional teachings. They need to be further interpreted. And the most important way to interpret those other teachings is through the principle of mind only. So anytime we say things are empty or things are dependently arisen and stuff, we need to keep in mind that for the Yogacaran, this means that things are all mentally created and things arise dependently in the mind, in minds. So this is an important hermeneutical principle for the Yogacara school, and it will also be important for later forms of Buddhism. Now, how does the Yogacara school explain ultimate reality and the world of experience? Well, the main theory here is what is called the three natures, or three svabhavas, three own nature, three inherent existences, and so on. And we find this exposition in the Arya Samdhinirmochana Sutra and in the 30 verses of Vasubandhu, also in the Mahayana Samgraha. This doctrine basically explains the way we experience the world, explains the whole world through these three natures. So the first nature is called the fully conceptualized nature, or the imaginary nature. This is the incorrect or faulty conceptually constructed way we experience things. These are our everyday appearances. And specifically, an important part of this is how we experience the world as being divided into subject and object, right? There's the subject here, and it's experiencing a world out there. This is a mistaken way of experiencing the world, and thus the whole idea of an external world is mistaken, according to Yogacara. This fully conceptualized nature is totally unreal. It's like a mirage. Now, the next principle, the next nature, is the dependent nature. This is dependent arising. This is the dependently arisen nature of phenomena. It is the causal process itself, the causal flux. It is the basis for the fully conceptualized nature. But it exists, it does exist ultimately, according to Yogacara. So this is like the ground of all experiences. It is also something which is beyond mind, beyond matter, and beyond self and other dualities. It is ultimately inexpressible, if you will. But it can be also explained as being dependent arising. The third nature is called the fully accomplished nature. This is the complete absence in the dependent nature of objects. That is, the objects of the conceptualized nature. This is how Asanga explains this third nature. What this means is that the fully accomplished nature is basically the experience that we have of the dependent nature when we've stripped away the fully conceptualized nature. That is the fully accomplished nature. So what a Buddha sees, what a Buddha experiences, it's just two. It's just a dependent nature. It's just a second nature. They don't experience a fully conceptualized nature. Most sentient beings experience one and two. A Buddha experiences two, fully stripped of one. That is the third fully accomplished nature. That's it. Vasubandhu uses a famous metaphor to explain these three natures. He says that the dependent nature is like a magician's illusion, which makes a pile of wood look like an elephant. The elephant is the fully conceptualized nature. And the pile of wood is just a fully accomplished nature. So if we see an elephant, we get scared of it, but then we realize that it's just a magician has created and has done some kind of magic trick to make a pile of wood look like an elephant. Once that happens, and once we see the pile of wood, then we're no longer scared of the elephant. So this metaphor sort of helps you understand how there's one thing that can be seen in different ways, and we can transform the way we see that dependent nature. And once we do that, we'll stop seeing it one way, we'll see it the other way. Jonathan Gold describes this as these three natures really as one reality. They're actually talking about the same thing, but they're looking at one reality from three different angles. He says they are the appearance, the process, and the emptiness of that same apparent entity. And this metaphysical and this metaphysical explanation is central to Yogacara. This is how they understand all phenomena. And all scriptural statements about the nature of reality, they're generally going to interpret it using this principle of the three natures. So Yogacara, being a Mahayana school, also has its own understanding of emptiness, and they use the three natures schema to understand emptiness. The three natures are also three emptinesses. They're each empty in a slightly different way. So the imputed nature, because it is a mistaken superimposition, it doesn't really exist. And this is compared to like seeing a mirage in the desert. You see a mirage, it appears to be water, but there's no water there. It's empty of water. The dependent nature, it does exist, according to Yogacara, but it is empty of what it appears to be. So even though the dependent nature might appear as water, so even though the dependent nature might appear to be one thing, it might appear to be the imputed nature, the first nature, the conceptualized nature. Just like a mirage might appear to be water, there's actually no water there. So likewise, the dependent nature is actually empty of the very conceptualization of the imputed nature. And finally, the perfected nature, what the perfected nature is just the very fact that there is no concepts in the dependent nature. So there is no water in the mirage. That's what the perfected nature is. And having that realization, having that understanding, is the perfected nature itself. So it is not any substantially existent thing. It is a negative fact about the dependent nature. It is a kind of absence. So in that sense, it is also empty. Another way that the Yogacara school understands emptiness is as non-duality. And here, for this tradition, non-duality means that there is no separation. There's no ultimate separation between subject and object, or the grasper and the thing that is grasped, the experience and the thing that is doing the experiencing. Ultimately, there is no difference between these two. So there's a non-duality there. That's not to say that Yogacara affirms some kind of monism, like Advaita Vedanta or anything like that. It is not. It is not that. It is beyond oneness and manyness. Right. The ultimate reality is beyond one. Is beyond being one thing or many things. It is, in a way, ineffable, unspeakable. And yet, conventionally, there are independent mind streams, different minds, different persons. So it is not a kind of idealistic monism. Now, Vasubandhu and Asanga, they did criticize the Madhyamaka school, at least certain interpretations of the Madhyamaka school, which they saw as being nihilistic. And you can see this in certain Yogacara texts. And this is kind of where the debate between these two schools begins. For the Yogacara philosophers, generally speaking, they do think that we can say that there's something which exists. Mainly the dependent nature, the mind-only dependent nature, consciousness. For the Yogacara and Vasubandhu, to speak of emptiness, it only makes sense if there is something that is empty, right? Like you can only speak of emptiness if there is something that we can say is empty. So if I say, oh yeah, there's something that is empty, at least for these thinkers, right? Like a cup, well, there has to be the cup. And then it's empty of something, it's empty of water. So in the same way for Asanga, there is something, and that something that exists is empty. But you need to say what we're talking about here. And for Asanga, that means the mind-only reality. And there's a quote here that I have from Asanga: the non-existence of the self and the existence of non-self. So that's how he explains emptiness. So for Asanga, there is something which exists, and that is not self. That is empty. That which exists. Another important thing to note about the Yogacara school Like previous Buddhist schools that we have discussed, they had a theory of a specific kind of consciousness that undergoes rebirth. We saw that there was a Mahasangika school that had a similar theory, and also the Sautrantika school had a theory of a kind of consciousness that undergoes rebirth. In the Yogacara school, this is called the storehouse consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana. And it's called the storehouse because it's kind of the place where it's the kind of consciousness that contains all of our karmic seeds from past actions, and it undergoes rebirth. So we take those impressions, those seeds, with us. This is a kind of subliminal consciousness, and it is also the source for all of our experiences of the seemingly external world. So we experience the external world as something that is separate from us, but really it's actually all of the experiences that we have of the external world, they're based on certain mental phenomena going on in these subliminal consciousnesses. And so when we see something in the external world and somebody else also sees the same thing, it's not because there's something out there. It's because we both have similar kinds of impressions, similar kinds of mental phenomena that are going on in our alaya vijnana, in our foundation consciousness. So we're experiencing our own foundational consciousnesses in a similar way. And in that way, we say, well, okay, there's an external object there. And we both agree that there's something out there. But really, we're all just experiencing our own subliminal foundational consciousness. It's an interesting system, which is highly like internalistic in that sense, right? Because there's no external world, but there is a subjective world, which we all share, and this subjective, this intersubjective world only exists on the basis of our own individual foundation consciousnesses. Another important feature of this foundational consciousness is that in the Yogacara analysis, there's another layer of our consciousness, which is called the defiled consciousness. And this layer of mind is aware of the subliminal consciousness, but it mistakes the subliminal consciousness for being a self. And this is what gets us into trouble. Because when we take the subliminal consciousness, which is constantly changing and filled with karmic seeds, filled with defilement and so on, and we misperceive it as being an eternal, unchanging thing, we reify it. That's where suffering comes in. So Yogačara's project is to transform that defiled consciousness and to basically get rid of it. Yogacara philosophy and Yogacara philosophical texts, they discuss many more topics. There's many huge Yogacara discussions on many other topics, but I've just covered the most important ones here. There's a lot of discussion on meditation, which I haven't really gone over because this is mainly a video about philosophy, not about like meditative practice and so on. But yeah, the Yogacara philosophy discusses a lot of things related to the spiritual path and so on. Especially the Yogacara Bhumi is this huge text that they have. And this is important in Yogacara, just like it's important in all forms of Buddhism. Again, something I just keep reiterating every time I talk about any of these philosophical systems is that the only reason they exist is because they're meant to support our spiritual path. So all Buddhist systems are the same. Another important element of the Yogacara system is that Yogacara authors, they assume that meditative experiences are special epistemic sources of knowledge, and that in some cases, meditation experiences we have in meditation or influenced by meditative states, they're actually superior to other sources of knowledge. And that's because they seem to give us a kind of non-conceptual way of experiencing reality, where usually we experience the world in a highly theory-laden manner, filled with all sorts of our own interpretations, our own emotions. Yogacara thinks that meditation allows us to sort of have a more pure experience of the world, and this is very important for their philosophical system, because if just like rational thinking and philosophy in an everyday sense can't get you to the ultimate truth, then the Yogacara system, at least the conceptual system of Yogacara, isn't really the ultimate thing that we should be doing. What we should be doing, yes, we should study these philosophies of the three natures and so forth, but at the end of the day, these are just kind of guidelines for our meditation and yogic practice. And when we engage in that, then we will actually understand the ultimate nature of things. So this is a kind of theme that we keep coming back to in this video. That yeah, I mean, in Buddhist philosophy, most Buddhist philosophers aren't going to say that their philosophical system is giving you some kind of ultimate explanation of the world. At best, it's going to be a useful guideline, a useful schema, a skillful means for being in the world, for understanding how the world works. But the real way of understanding it is through a more non-conceptual, yogic, intuitive sense. And I think most Buddhist philosophers will agree with this. At least most Mahayana Buddhist philosophers. Yeah. Okay, so we've finished the first video of part 1, where we've covered the history of Buddhist philosophy from its beginnings and its background in ancient India and the Buddha, all the way to about the 4th or 5th century CE, and the Mahayana, the two main Mahayana philosophies, Yogacara and Madhyamaka. And these are just some of the sources that I used in this video. There's some really good sources that you can just find them on Google. So I have a few of these here that in parentheses that say, if you just Google the name of this and PDF next to the name, you'll find a PDF of it. Some of these are also available in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I've used a bunch of articles from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They're written by many of the big names in the field of Buddhist philosophy right now and Buddhist studies. So I mean, they're great. SuttaCentral.net is a great source for early Buddhist texts. So a lot of the sutras that I cited when discussing the thought of the Buddha can be found here. Actually, all of them can be found here. So if you just search Google the name of the sutta and SuttaCentral.net, you'll find it. You'll find the text, and usually there'll be different translations of the same text. There's Jan Westerhoff, Golden Age of Indian Buddhist Philosophy is probably my favorite right there, and yeah, and also Jan Westerhoff is probably my favorite Buddhist philosopher working right now. I don't know how much of a Buddhist he is, but like, he's working in Buddhist philosophy. So I mean, that's what I mean by that. Yeah. So then the next video we're gonna do is gonna be following the rest of the history of Indian Buddhist philosophy, and that's going to cover later Yogacara philosophers, later Madhyamaka philosophers like Chandrakirti and Bhaviveka and Dharmakirti and Dignaga, and then also different ideas such as the philosophy of Buddha nature and the tantric Buddhist philosophers, all the way up to the end of Buddhism in India. So stay tuned for the next video.